iHeartRadio Broadway, driven by Mercedes-Benz. The best or nothing.
Jennifer Ashley Tepper, welcome to iHeartRadio Broadway.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
First and foremost, we're almost a year into the Broadway shutdown, and I'm checking in with everybody who's coming on to this channel. How are you doing right now? How are you at the almost 1 year anniversary of the shutdown?
I'm doing okay. Like so many of us during the pandemic, I think it goes in waves, whether we're doing okay, how okay we're doing. But I'm feeling really hopeful based on just like friends getting the vaccine every day. And honestly, I've spent the past year writing my book, and just having it come out just makes me feel a bit of hope. So I'm feeling good these days. How about you?
I'm good. I think the same. I'm feeling hopeful. I think the starting conversations with Broadway reopening and people wanting to start the planning phase of when we're coming back has been, I think, a bit of a boon to lift morale right now. So I think that's been really good in the last couple of weeks.
Totally.
So we are here to talk about your brand new book, Untold Stories. It's volume 4. First of all, did you ever think in your wildest imagination that we would be talking about volume 4 of your series in the middle of a pandemic with the Broadway shutdown?
No, I mean, that has been such a crazy piece of this. I started writing the book series in 2013, and we immediately realized that in order to cover all of the Broadway theaters, it would probably need to be like 6 volumes. So the first 3 volumes came out pretty quickly, like in, 2013, 2014, 2016. And then I was busy with so many other, theater related work things that it took until 2021 for the fourth volume to come out. And my main silver lining of this pandemic has just been having time to write it. But at the same time, no, it's studying Broadway history and looking at all these stories. It's been so interesting to find parallels to things that Broadway's going through right now. Not to say that Broadway has ever shut down for a year, because it hasn't, but certainly there have been moments writing the book where, I've written about like the first time Broadway had radio plays, and everyone was like, why would people want to do that? Why would people want to go to Broadway when they can listen to the radio play at home? And of course, radio plays just made Broadway plays even more popular. So I'm like, that's similar to streaming. It's been interesting, but at the same time, it's like writing about Broadway when there is no Broadway has been wild.
So I should mention, not only do you have this ongoing series, and we're going to expect 2 more books out of the series, you're a theater producer, you're the curator of the Jonathan Larson Project, you're a Broadway historian. You have so many things that you do to add this book series on top of it. Was this just like the most rewarding challenge to take on because of your love for Broadway history?
Absolutely. Because I like grew up in South Florida, very obsessed with Broadway from afar, like many of us are. And so for me, the Broadway theaters were like a fascinating thing to study, because since I couldn't go to the Imperial, I was like, oh, what's been at the Imperial? Oh, Pippin and Dreamgirls. And when I go to New York, this is what'll be there. So to kind of make those spaces come to life from afar, and then to do it as a theater historian, has been an incredibly rewarding journey.
I think I used to work at Playbill, and one of the favorite things in the Playbill was At This Theater. And it was always like the condensed version. And I feel like this is the grown up tome of At This Theater, which I absolutely love. But talk to me about breaking it down, because when you started this, instead of it being a one off and a huge tome of all the Broadway history, you decided to make it specifically about certain theaters. Why was that important to you to break it down that way and not just a one off book?
As I started to dig into it, I realized that, in order to tell the story of the Richard Rodgers Theater, I had to interview a door person who worked there, and, actors from the 70s and musicians from the 80s, and who did a play there when they did a straight play there. So it became clear that in order to tell the full story of each theater, I really needed to do like a good amount of interviews. It's been really interesting during 2020 and 2021 to look at the majority of my interviews happened in 2013, even though I've done a lot since then. But it's such a time capsule, not only to have, this story from 1960, but the person told it to me in 2013. So what was different about it because of that? Yeah, it's so interesting. But I really did realize that in order to tell the full story, I would need to have 6 volumes.
And so not only so with this book in volume 4, we're talking the Imperial Theater, the Jacobs, Studio 54, the Minskoff. Am I getting? I just want to make sure I get them
I'm
all
so
in there.
It's got the Friedman,
Friedman.
Golden, and the Fallen Five, which is the 5 theaters that were demolished to build the Marriott Marquis in 1982.
So when you're planning it out, how do you structure it to say these are the theaters that I want in this book? Is it very strategic where it's like the Imperial's not marked with the new Amsterdam or anything like that.
Totally. I think it was, our intention truly to make a variety of theaters like come to life in each book. So, having bigger theaters and smaller theaters, having Schubert theaters and Niederlander theaters, having theaters that have been beloved for their entire life and have, had so many hits, and having theaters that were more underappreciated. Studio 54, one of my big discoveries of this book, didn't have a hit show for 71 years. And it's like, the Imperial in the 60s didn't have a show that ran for less than a year. So it's been interesting to kind of come up with those juxtapositions of different theaters. And also each book includes a lost theater, which is, it took me until volume 4 to be like, okay, I'm ready to do the Fallen Five. So that's kind of how we decide.
So talk to me about the Fallen Five, because it is kind of fascinating to see all of this history come to life with theaters that people don't really know about. What did you discover when doing your research on the Fallen Five?
I've always been so fascinated by them. The Morosco, the Bijou, the old Helen Hayes, the Gaiety, and the Astor were demolished in '82 when theaters weren't as in demand. It was just a different situation in New York. And so, it was the idea to build a hotel that would bring new life to New York. And I love the Marriott Marquis and I love the Marquis Theater. But at the time, there were huge protests. There were people that were doing plays on like makeshift stages. There were people handcuffing themselves to Morosco. I would have been one of them if I'd been there in '82. And it was so fascinating to interview so many theater professionals who were doing shows there, who saw shows there, who chained themselves to the theaters and all of that. And so many of them had interesting things to say that I think are good lessons. One of my main takeaways from it, though, was, if I could go back in time, I would change it. I'm not saying like great things came from it, but, the thing that did come from that horrible thing that happened of the 5 theaters getting demolished was that basically all the other Broadway theaters were landmarked. So essentially, because of the protests, they couldn't save those 5, but there was such a huge uproar that even, the city government got involved and was like, okay, let's landmark this theater. Okay, also that theater, this interior, this exterior. So chances are, if that hadn't happened, some of the other theaters would have been demolished before that happened. So it's made me kind of go, okay, like what good things are going to come from this time? Not to say we wanted to have this time, but like when theater is involved, I think that good things usually come from even tragedy.
And I will say, what I love about the book is it doesn't just necessarily you're not necessarily just talking to actors or the big names. You're talking to the doorman, you're talking to the former ushers, you're talking to backstage crew members. It's a full collection of people who have worked on Broadway, currently working on Broadway, and names that we all know and recognize. But you have done your due diligence to make sure everybody gets a say in the history of Broadway, which I love. Um, do you have a favorite story that's currently in volume 4?
As I was rereading Volume 4 to edit it, I was like, this volume has a lot of stories from musicians and music teams. I'm really proud of how I'm like trying to kind of like advocate for like, here's what the sub musician experience is, and here's what musicians experience in the pit. So there's a lot of those that I love. There's also this amazing thing in the Jacobs chapter of this stagehand at the Jacobs, who's very beloved, named Mike Van Prague, who I got to interview, who's part of 4 generations of stagehands in his family, and who started working there with his father, who was a stagehand at the Jacobs in the 60s and, is still working there. And he has like extraordinary stories about the theater because, the stagehands, it's like really their home and they stay there. And his stories, I kind of try to have like a narrator in each chapter. And it's usually a person who is like the house manager or like a stagehand, someone who's like really there. And he's the narrator of the Jacobs chapter. And every time I read his stories, I'm just blown away by them all over again.
I think one of my favorites, and I had to pull it up, was from 1972 at the Imperial, Don Scardino, the story about the Fosse bathroom, but then going into the audition for Pippin, but still getting called in because they liked him to go into Godspell. It's such a great story. And it's a story that you wouldn't necessarily get in a regular Broadway history book necessarily. So I think that first person collection of just funny, poignant moments just is what makes this so well done. So just congratulations on that.
Thank you. I'm so glad you brought that one up because another one of my favorite things to talk to people about is that there used to be more auditions in Broadway theater. So, usually if someone is an actor and they're over a certain age, I'm like, did you ever have one? And sometimes Don Scardino is like, yeah, here's my Bob Fosse audition story at the Imperial. I love that story too.
It's so great. I actually cackled out loud with the bathroom story. So I tell you all to read that one specifically on page 39 because you will get such a kick out of it. I will say, going into volume 4, I know that you started this in 2013, but Broadway has changed in the last year, specifically the Broadway shutdown, where, the call for racial and social justice conversations again. Did that change your perspective into editing Volume 4? And I know a part of the proceeds from Volume 4 is going to the Broadway Advocacy Coalition.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say almost on every page, my editor and I were like, okay, like, is this a chance that we can have to like amplify this or to advocate for that? So much of it involves, the Black artists on Broadway and like the kind of things that we've been talking about over the last year. I will say what was kind of interesting to me was like my favorite, maybe my number one favorite musical I've ever seen on Broadway was Shuffle Along. Shuffle Along
Mhm.
was like a show a couple years ago that was about Black artists on Broadway who like had been forgotten. And that show blew open my brain as a historian and went like, oh, how can I better amplify stories that have been forgotten and Black artists? So for me, my journey with doing that started a bit in 2016 with that show, but certainly over the last year have been thinking about it in all kinds of different ways. And what's crazy is that there were a lot of really important, Black artists who worked on Broadway in the beginning of the 20th century who have been forgotten. So in addition to trying to interview more artists of color and like get those stories into the books, I've done a lot of work to go, okay, like, why don't we remember this person? And in fact, one of the theaters that was demolished to build the marquee had something above it that was referred to as Black Tin Pan Alley, which was when some of the Black Broadway songwriters weren't invited to what was regular Tin Pan Alley. That was the building that they worked in. So finding like facts like that and like being able to shine a light on different moments in history and figuring out how to like put them in the book has definitely been a journey.
So, moving just a little bit away from the book, this interview is going to air at the start of International Women's Day, International Women's Month, which is March. You also tell a lot of stories from the perspective of women and women who have been on Broadway and championing changes on Broadway. Is there a woman or a collective of women that you have looked up to within this community that we're in that you can talk about a little bit?
That's a great question. Someone I've been thinking a lot about, she's one of the like opening stories of the book is Anita Gillette, who all of her stories about the Imperial, I think, are about specific shows. They're about, her run in the original Gypsy, the original Carnival, like all these incredible cabaret. But it does, circle so much around like her experience as a woman in the industry. She even tells this story about how when she got pregnant, they wanted to fire her from Gypsy, and Ethel Merman was like, "Don't you dare fire the kid. She can still do the cartwheels." And so it's been interesting to me in like talking to women of different generations while writing this book to see how those kinds of things came into play and how they've changed and how they haven't changed. And similar to kind of the stories of like, oh, I can't interview someone from the 1920s, but oh, there was a woman who produced a ton on Broadway in the 1920s and she was the only one who did it at this theater. Trying to amplify those stories as well has definitely been a part of this book.
And so, as we start to move forward to a reopening, a reemergence of Broadway again, hopefully sooner rather than later, what's the one thing that you're kind of looking forward to when we do emerge from this shutdown?
I'm just fascinated by the idea that like because nothing like this has ever happened, we don't know kind of what changes will occur, but I think the initial reopening will be so gradual, and there'll be like a immediate period when things start to happen when it's really New Yorkers going to the theater, and then maybe like tri-state area. It just literally as far as logistics, getting people back to New York, I think might change the kind of theater we see in the beginning time, and I'm really interested by that and how that's going to happen. But mostly it's like the idea of the energy in all of these theaters and the immediate reopening. I can't imagine what that's going to be like. I mean, that's like the historic moment for all of our lives that we're going to get to experience. So I just can't wait to like be at a show every night experiencing it.
I was saying I was in a meeting last night and I was like, I'm partly super excited about the reopening, but then I'm terrified of the opening, just the logistics of how it's all going to work. So it's this like question mark. How is it going to work? Are we all reopening at the same time, which won't happen most likely, but I'm fascinated with how it's all going to happen.
Totally, totally. And like question mark, we're all in this together and no one's done it before. So
And with that, I mean, again, we already talked about it, but with the amount of social changes that we've been advocating for this year during the shutdown, is there something that you're looking forward to potentially seeing change within the Broadway industry when we do reopen?
Yeah, I think that what I'm really looking forward to is like a lot of these great conversations we've all been having on screens, we'll be able to like have in rehearsal rooms too. And I think just the idea of, for all shows, having all kinds of people in the room is such a positive change that people are really wanting to move forward with. So I'm kind of just excited to see what conversations happen once we're literally making a show and like fixing the problem, as opposed to just trying to fix the problem, if that makes sense. I think that like it's going to be a really exciting leap forward for a lot of the things we've been wanting to change.
And any big projects on the horizon for you besides talking about the brand new volume 4 for the Untold Stories of Broadway?
Yeah, there were so many things at the time of the shutdown that I was working on. One of them that I've been thinking about a lot is like I was doing this big celebration of Hal Prince's underappreciated musicals with a huge cast of like all folks who had known him and had done them. And writing this book, it's become very like meaningful that there are 13 interviewees that have passed away that are in the book now, including Hal. And so figuring out like a way to honor their legacies in the book, and like otherwise, when we reopen, I'm just so excited to like celebrate his shows in a room with other people. That's something I've been looking forward to.
Well, I will say if you haven't read volumes 1 through 3, now volume 4, go out and buy The Untold Stories of Broadway by Jennifer Ashley Tepper. Sorry, I just stuttered a little bit. They're brilliant. It's such a great tome of history. It's fascinating and funny and poignant, and I promise you, you will. There are twists and turns in there that you will be completely surprised by, and I implore you all to go out and buy these volumes because they're fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you so, so much.
Um, can you tell people where they can actually buy the books if they don't know where to get them?
Absolutely. You can buy any of the Untold Stories of Broadway volumes on Amazon, or you can buy them on dresscirclepublishing.com.
Perfect. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us at iHeartRadio Broadway today. And we can't wait to see you in a theater or at an opening night party or anything like that soon. So we hope you have the greatest rest of the winter, summer, whenever we're back in the theater.
You too. Thank you so much again for having me.
iHeartRadio Broadway, driven by Mercedes-Benz. The best or nothing.